In March 1922, a farmer in Bavaria found footprints in the snow. They came from the forest. They led to his farm. None of them led back.
Bavaria, Germany, 1922. A small farmstead called Hinterkaifeck, which means in German, behind Kaifeck. Behind the nearest hamlet, behind the road, behind the tree line. A farm at the very edge of things. 6 people lived there. Andreas Gruber, 63, his wife Cecilia, 72, their daughter Victoria, 35, Victoria's children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph, and the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had arrived that very morning. It was her first day. It was also her last.
To understand what happened at Hinterkaifeck, you have to understand what the weeks before it looked like. Because the horror of this story does not begin on the night of the murders. It begins 6 months earlier. 6 months before the murders, the Gruber family's maid quit. She gave a reason. She said the house was haunted, that she had heard noises coming from the attic at night when no one should have been there. Andreas Gruber dismissed it. He found a new maid. Then, in early March 1922, Andreas found a newspaper on his property. A newspaper from Munich that he had not bought, that no one in the family had bought, that no neighbor subscribed to. It had simply appeared. Days before the murders, a snowstorm blanketed the farm. Andreas walked the property the next morning and found them. Footprints, emerging from the tree line, leading across the snow to the farm's machine room, whose lock, he now noticed, had been broken for weeks. He followed the prints to the door. He searched the machine room, the barn, the house, the attic. He found nothing. But the prints didn't lead back to the forest. Wherever the person had come from, they hadn't left. Andreas told a neighbor about the footprints. The neighbor suggested he call the police. Andreas said no. That night, the family heard footsteps in the attic. Again, Andreas went up to look. Again, he found nothing. But what investigators would later note is that a mattock was found hidden in that attic, covered in dried blood, after the murders. On the afternoon of March 31st, Maria Baumgartner arrived at Hinterkaifeck. Her sister drove her there and left quickly, likely the last person outside the farm to see any of them alive. That evening, someone lured the family to the barn, one by one. Andreas first, then his wife, then Victoria, then 7-year-old Cecilia. Each of them killed with blows to the head from the family's own mattock. Then the killer moved to the house. Joseph, 2 years old, in his crib. Maria Baumgartner in her bedroom on her first night in a new job. Here is what the police found when they arrived 4 days later. The bodies of the 4 barn victims had been stacked on top of each other, covered with hay, arranged deliberately. The cattle had been fed, meals had been prepared and eaten in the kitchen, a bed had been slept in, smoke had been seen rising from the chimney by neighbors for days after the murders. The killer had not fled. The killer had stayed, living in the house, eating the food, tending the animals, while 6 bodies lay in the barn and the bedrooms.
Inspector Georg Reingruber of the Munich police arrived at Hinterkaifeck on April 4th. He wrote in his initial report, "The perpetrator remained at the scene for days following the crime. They slept in the beds, prepared meals in the kitchen, and tended to the livestock as if they belonged there." But what investigators found next made even less sense.
7-year-old Cecilia had not died immediately. The blow to her head had not killed her outright. She had lain in the barn, in the dark, for hours. Investigators found evidence that in those hours she had pulled out her own hair, in fistfuls, from the trauma, from the cold, from lying beside her family in the dark. She was 7 years old. On a wall inside the farmhouse, investigators found a calendar, the page showing April 1st. The murders had taken place on March 31st. Someone had torn the page off, changed the date, as if marking the morning after. When the farm was demolished in 1923, additional evidence was found. A mattock, the murder weapon, hidden in the attic, still covered in dried blood. A penknife buried in the hay of the barn. And then, in a final detail so strange it has never been fully explained, the victims' heads were removed after the autopsies and sent to Munich for further examination. During World War II, the skulls were lost. The Gruber family lies buried today in Weidhofen, without their heads.
More than 100 suspects were investigated. Not one was ever charged. Not one. The theories have never stopped. A neighbor named Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who helped discover the bodies, was long suspected. He had an unusual knowledge of the farm, an unusual familiarity with the crime scene. He sued anyone who called him the murderer. He won every case. Another theory, Victoria's husband, declared dead in World War I, body never found. Some believed he faked his death, returned to find his wife and the farm he had lost, and the child that may not have been his, and destroyed all of it. In 2007, students from the Furstenfeldbruck Police Academy reopened the case using modern forensic techniques. They studied it for months. They came to a conclusion. They identified, they believed, who the killer was. They refused to release the name, out of respect for the killer's descendants who still lived in the area. The case is now over 100 years old. The farm is gone. The evidence is degraded or missing. Several suspects died before they could be properly investigated. The skulls of the victims were lost in a war that happened 20 years after they died. And the footprints in the snow that came from the forest, that led to the farm, that never led back, those are gone too. Andres Gruber told his neighbor about the footprints. The neighbor said, "Call the police." Andres said no. Nobody knows why. There is a detail in this case that the investigators who reopened it in 2007 found the most disturbing of all. Not the footprints, not the calendar page, not the 3 days the killer spent in the house. It was this. The killer knew the farm, knew the layout, knew the family's movements, knew how to feed the animals, knew which bed to sleep in, knew how to operate the kitchen. This was not a stranger. This was someone for whom Hinterkaifeck felt like home. The site where Hinterkaifeck stood is an empty field today. A small cenotaph marks it. No names on it. Just the location. Just the place. And the forest. is still there.
The next story begins in the dark. Subscribe to uncover it.